In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the Reformation in an effort to understand the context of the importance of Luther and Calvin. Now, in some ways, it goes without saying that the Reformation was important. Most people are aware that because of Luther and his immediate successors, that the fabric of the Western Church was ripped, and that we now have two large groups, on the one hand, the Catholic Church, and on the other hand, the Protestant Church. Some of us already love the subject. We have a certain gravitational pull to the personality of someone like Luther as he stands there before the emperor saying, "Here I stand." And we certainly appreciate his love of the gospel. With Calvin, we can appreciate all kinds of things. The clarity of his thinking, the formation of the Genevan Church, and the influence, frankly, internationally, of the Reformed movement over areas like Scotland, England, France, the Netherlands, and all the way into the New World in America. Others of us know that it's an important period of time, but we're not quite sure what happened there. We know some of the stories, some of the slogans. We know some of what happened. But it still remains something of a mystery for us. And I always start any discussion of the Reformation with the simple question, just what in the world happened back there? Because if you look at it, around the time of 1517, with Luther posting the 95 Theses and all of the controversy that erupted after it, you went from a single Western church to now the formation of several of the most magisterial and important denominational trends in the entirety of the Western world. Just about any group that we can think of in evangelicalism or Protestantism has direct links all the way back to this fight. And we're going to talk about some of these links over time, but it needs to be said now. So much of the denominational variety that we talk about today exists because of the Reformation. Even relatively newer denominations by name, and even the more recent non-denominational movement, itself is driven by the Reformation. The Reformation doesn't really cause denominations, but it is the context of it, because it removes the papacy as the organizing principle of the church, and therefore groups are able to collect themselves however they wish, whether it's a congregational government or denominational government. And I think if we're going to talk about the importance of the Reformation, we can look at really a couple of things that are the most important features of the changes wrought by the Reformation. We're going to set theology aside for a second, and we're going to just talk about some of the cultural changes that happened. If you were to go back in time and be there just prior to the Reformation, the entire fabric of your life was saturated and influenced by the Catholic way of life. It almost goes without saying, but we need to at least highlight this. Clergy, anyone in ministry prior to Luther, was ideally celibate, and while some broke their vows out of lust or out of sin, it can be difficult to get your mind around. Monasticism was everywhere. Priests, bishops, the hierarchy of the clergy. Also, the pattern of day in and day out life was entirely Catholic. In general, the average worker, for example, in the Middle Ages, had 30 days of holidays. Now, I know that sounds pretty awesome, but a holiday is a holy day. That is to say, it's part of the liturgical calendar. Day in and day out life, festivals, pilgrimages, all of the things that were part and parcel to the medieval way of life were affecting day in and day out life of even the average farmer. The life of penance and confession, concerns about purgatory, where the state of our souls is, these kinds of things, was just simply the fabric of life. And so attempting to understand one of the major importances of the Reformation, we have to look at the sociological impact. There are dramatic changes. Pastors, by and large, become married in Protestantism, almost always. Congregations become less focused on the hierarchy and more focused on a more holistic culture of the priesthood of all believers. And we're going to talk about what the priesthood of all believers means in a later lecture. And more importantly, without the concept of confession and penance and works for salvation, without this concept of merit that was the backbone of the Catholic view of salvation, the very idea of the Christian life itself changes. Suddenly the goal isn't to save one's soul, but to rest in the comfort of the work of Christ. And there have been all kinds of ways to understand the impact of the Reformation. We're not going to go into all of them, but there is one in particular that needs to be cited here because it's always talked about, and that is the Weber thesis. Max Weber was a sociologist, and his main concern was in correcting the modern assumption that religion is irrelevant to socioeconomic life. And so a lot of Weber's work argues that religion actually drives change culturally. And for a lot of us now, that seems patently obvious, but in his day, it was at least somewhat denied, if not outright seen as a falsity. And one of Weber's main contentions is that the Reformation dramatically shaped the way men and women worked. In fact, he goes so far as to say that the Reformation caused capitalism. And his argument is essentially that with the collapsing of the sacred-secular distinction, the average worker is then freed up to do his or her work for the glory of God. They don't have to consider dropping everything, leaving their farms behind, and going and being a monk in order to achieve assurance of salvation. And he argues that that puts a real privilege on work. Work is now seen as a glory to God, just the average craftsman, for example. Now, we're not going to go into the Weber thesis right now. We'll talk about it a bit along the way. There are some problems with it. There's some problems of it historically. He gets the Middle Ages pretty wrong along the way in his historical account. But we're not going to sit here and beat him up. The importance of it, though, is what Weber introduces into the conversation of the modern world is an appreciation for the fact that the Reformation just wasn't a theological movement. It was an entire cultural movement. It changed just about everything. Another place that we can talk about the importance of the Reformation is the rise and the formation of nations. In the impact of religion, Protestant versus Catholic, on these nations is going to be staggeringly important for at least a century, if not for 2 or 3 centuries thereafter. If you just look at a map of Europe, obviously prior to the Reformation, all of these countries are Catholic. After the Reformation, though, we see a number of countries that through varying degrees of conflict and overturning of the Catholic Church, what we see happen is nations moving to be autonomous and in some cases to be fully Protestant. Now, there is nothing in this day and age like the separation of church and state. All of these countries, all of these nations still, even if they become fully Protestant, believe in a more or less amalgam or an entanglement between church and state. But what we do see is the rise of a belief that the political order does not need to be answerable to the Pope, but rather it is its own entity, its own autonomous region within the secular or temporal world. And the dramatic change in nations is not irrelevant to the concept of the Reformation itself. Take England, for example. Now, Henry VIII, as he enacts the Reformation, has not a Protestant bone in his body. If there is any Anglican ever who is Catholic without a pope, it's Henry VIII. He wants a lot of the traditional rites. He still likes the 7 sacraments. He actually wrote a treatise against Luther called On the 7 Sacraments. He hated Luther, wished he could have gotten his hands on him and strangled him himself in some ways. But Henry's fight with the Pope over his attempt to have a divorce from Catherine of Aragon led to a rupturing of England that gave rise to all of the things that we know about England from that point on. Henry has himself declared head of the church. He is now temporally over the Church of England itself, a fact, by the way, that still stands to this day. The current queen, Queen Elizabeth, is still considered to be head of the church. She's now known by a different name, governor of the church, but it functionally is the same thing. If you ever go live in England on Christmas Day, the queen actually delivers a sermon, believe it or not, exercising her role as the head or the governor of the church. Look at Scotland, which had a very devout Catholic leadership, and through essentially something like a palace coup, eventually overthrew that government and established itself through the work of John Knox and others as a Protestant nation. Germany is even more important, and France. Both of these countries move in a Protestant direction, but not entirely. And if you take Germany just as an example, you have cities and villages and regions that effectively become a religious civil war within the nation. And so this region might be Protestant, and the region next to it might be Catholic. And the tension of what was formerly a united society, at least in terms of culture, now being divided and hating and having challenges against the theologies of that group or this group, led to some of the more dramatic cultural and national changes throughout Europe. After college, for example, I lived in the city of Munster in Germany, and I studied at the university there. I was in the theology faculty there. And one of the more striking things that was told to me about the city, even down until today, is that after the Reformation, the city of Munster was, by and large, essentially split down the middle. It was half Catholic and half Lutheran, or as they say, evangelical, evangelische. And it was a striking reality because I remember being a part of the evangelische theology faculty, being essentially in the Protestant wing, and noticing that right next door was a Catholic wing, and they had both been established within the university. And this is a university that has a long history, and here, even woven into the fabric of the university, is this division between Catholic theology faculties on the one hand and Protestant faculties on the other. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. You go to France. France enacted some of the bloodiest pogroms against Protestants in the entirety of the post-Reformation era. France was a nation that very nearly gave in to the Protestant impulse. But the king and eventually the Queen Mother put it down with aggression, leading eventually to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and the murder, frankly, of thousands upon thousands of Calvinists. And all of this tension and all these fights and all these skirmishes give rise to what we call the wars of religion. And the wars of religion are essentially nation upon nation and community upon community going to war over various reasons, but the kernel in all of them is Protestants versus Catholics. If you look today at the context of the Netherlands, what used to be called the Lowlands, today you'll see that there are actually two countries there, Belgium and the Netherlands. Well, the fact is in the Reformation era, those two nations were one. And because of the Reformation and because of the Protestant influence, and the fact that the region was owned by the very Catholic emperor, Holy Roman Emperor of Europe, meant that the country went essentially into civil war. And it was ripped in half, and from that point on, eventually the development of Belgium on the one hand and the Netherlands on the other meant that the Reformation's impact on that region was significant, culturally as well as politically. Well, all these wars, the wars of religion themselves, culminate in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. And during this war, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 35% of the entire population of Europe was killed. In fact, it was, by some estimations, the bloodiest war, the single largest loss of life until World War I. And so the impact and the importance of the Reformation is significant. It gives rise to the context and the capacity of nations to go to war with one another. What else? Well, next we have something like the Enlightenment. I think in most students' mind, they see the Reformation and the Renaissance in these periods as somehow shrink-wrapped and compartmentalized away from the Enlightenment. But if you just look at the dates, the Enlightenment really gets going, truthfully gets going, within the context of the post-Reformation world. It arises in particular during these wars of religion. And there are all kinds of debates on this. Some see the Enlightenment as a product of the Reformation itself. This has at times been a Catholic allegation that Protestants destroyed the fabric of the church and gave privilege for people to think for themselves, in a manner of speaking, or to think their own theology, to not appeal to authority, and that sort of formed the kernel intellectually of the Enlightenment. Now, there's lots of reasons to doubt this conclusion. Usually something as important as a big movement like the Enlightenment does not get going because of one single cause. Still, Protestants have to understand that some of the early impulses of the Enlightenment and some of the early Enlightenment thinkers were in fact Protestant. That for whatever reason, they embarked on this belief that rationalism, empiricism, is the way forward to determine truth and everything else in this world. Now, of course, Enlightenment does not get going with a real antagonism to religion per se, but over time that unalloyed rationalism does certainly take root, and it begins to foster this belief that religion is the enemy of rationalism or good thinking or science. Next, and certainly not least, is the development of confessions and the theology of the Reformation itself. One of the things that we're going to look at in a course like this, where we're looking at Luther and Calvin side by side, is we're going to notice some of the sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle differences between their theologies. And these differences of theologies become woven into the confessional matrix of Lutheranism on the one hand and the Reformed movement on the other. Now, the Reformed movement is not synonymous with the thinking of Calvin. It's more complex, and it has, as I like to say, a band of brothers who are the intellectual forerunners and developers of the Reformed tradition. But still, the division on certain key issues between Lutheranism on the one hand and the Reformed movement on the other has a significant impact on the development of Protestantism in general, particularly in the New World, and itself in the development of evangelicalism. To this day, repeatedly, for example, there are pastors and groups and ministries and nonprofits and all these things that get into tussles and fights and sometimes skirmishes, really significant ones, over doctrinal points of division that frankly go all the way back to this Reformed Lutheran split. Take one just as an example. Should Christians, after they have converted, after they have rested in the work of Christ, should Christians use the law in order to encourage themselves to sanctification? This is known as the third use of the law problem, which we'll get into very explicitly in a later lecture. Well, how many groups, how many pastors, how many fights have arisen over the issue of, do I rest only in the work of Christ and care significantly less, if at all, for sanctification issues? Or do I need to use the law after my conversion to strive for sanctification, we might say, strive for obedience? So many fights on that. All go back to the Reformation. There are differences of sacramentology, different views of the Lord's Supper. Is it a physical eating or is it a spiritual eating? Or is it just simply a memorial service where we think about the death of Christ? What about baptism? Do we baptize infants or do we baptize believers? Church polity, is it a bishopric system? A diocesan system, as we see in certain nations? Is it an elder synodal form of government, as we see in certain forms of Presbyterianism? Is it congregational, like we see in Baptist and in non-denominational churches? These fights all come out of the Reformation, these issues, these debates. And I could go on belaboring this point, but it needs to be said right now, the importance and the impact of the Reformation hits on all levels of a person. In other words, it hits them who they are as citizens, depending on what nation they're a part of, depending on what region within that nation that they're a part of. It hits them personally. There are countless stories of peasants and layfolk who come to church one day to discover they're Protestant, and all of the warp and the woof of their Christian existence, of confession, of the Eucharist, of veneration of the saints and of Mary, is suddenly expunged. That is no small change. But above all, and really the importance of the focus that I'm going to have, at least by the end of this course, is the theological changes and the proliferation of discussion of the biblical teaching is so important for the Reformation, is so dependent on the Reformation, and is so driven by the Reformation, that so much of what we consider today to be good biblical research is a product of that flourishing of biblical engagement. Take, for example, the study of Hebrew. Now, there's a lot of things that are made about the Renaissance study of Hebrew, that people were really in-depthly studying Hebrew. But the fact of the matter is they were not doing it very well. If you go back and look at a first edition of the earliest Hebrew grammars, really all they had was a very short grammatical instruction, maybe 15, 20 pages. And the rest was word root studies. Not exactly a deep engagement. Well, what the Reformation brings, just as an example, just in terms of its impact, is reformers and Protestants are so concerned to delve into Scripture that they find themselves doing things like discovering and unpacking and working for the first time in Aramaic. There's actually a man who was Jewish originally who had converted to Christianity, who eventually makes his way to England and is there at the University of Cambridge where he is looking at these texts that he begins to parse out that Aramaic is its own thing. Hebrew itself takes a dramatic leap forward, not for its own sake, but for the sake of the fact that the Christians of the Protestant traditions in particular strove incessantly to understand the Scriptures in their original. And so the flourishing of this theological conversation is born out of that biblical engagement. And so it stands to reason that all of these issues that we still feel pressures on today, debates sometimes that we are aware of the controversy, but sometimes not aware of the categories that are being fought over, very frequently have their origin back here in the Reformation. And so the importance of the Reformation really stands tall amongst the periods of history. It is one of the most pivotal times in the change of the Western world. Now, to conclude, I want to give you 3 categories of how we sort of break up the Reformation. And there are other ways to do this. One of the more popular, newer ways to engage with the Reformation is to just look at it country by country. And this tactic is born mostly of the fear, and it's a good one, and it's a real fear, to not read the Reformation as one monolithic experience that happens across all nations. It simply is not. The Reformation is experienced differently in England and in Scotland and in Germany and France and in the Swiss regions. But setting aside the geographical focus, simply for the sake of time and space, there is a traditional way of organizing the main branches of the Reformation movements theologically that have really stood the test of time. They're a bit oversimplistic, and they certainly prejudice both scholars and students a little too much. But if we just understand that these are artificial brackets that are used to understand the branches of the Reformation movement, then they're actually a bit helpful for the student who's first coming to this. And the 3 movements, as historians have noted them, are the Magisterial Reformation, the Radical Reformation, and the Counter/Catholic Reformation. Now, let me tell you what all 3 of these are. When referring to the Magisterial Reformation, scholars mean by that the reformers who got connected and really ingrained into society itself. In almost every case, these groups were bound up in the politics of their day. That's actually what the word magisterial refers to here, that these are the reformers who were either partners with the rulers of their lands or their regions, or at times they were opposed and in opposition to these regimes. So we can think, for example, of Luther or Calvin or Cranmer or John Knox in Scotland or the Huguenots in France. Each of these groups have a core conviction of Protestantism in their theology, and to greater or lesser extents, they were involved in the politics of their day. Luther very much was a supporter, and in many ways he cultivated relationships with the princes and the nobility. One of his earliest treatises, in fact, was called To the Christian Nobility, and he called on them to reform the church in lieu of the Pope himself backing reform. Calvin in Geneva himself was similarly, though at times very much at odds with certain factions within Geneva, was nevertheless established in Christendom motif of the intermingling of politics and the church. So that's the Magisterial Reformation. They are the big-ticket folks. They're the people that many recognize, and they are the forerunners of so much of the later denominationalism that comes out of Protestantism. There's another group, though, that are equally Protestant, and they are a group that we refer to as the Radical Reformation. Now, radical here does not mean that they are fringe, rogue element folks. Now, some are. Some have really strange views here and there. But by and large, what we mean by the Radical Reformation is simply the group that would not toe the line with the government. And we can see this, for example, in Zwingli's Zurich, where Zwingli, trying to enact some reforms, had to slow the pace of his change to accommodate the city council. And there were a number in Zurich at the time who felt that that was a compromise. And they challenged this, and they said that you are not far enough, you're in bed with the politicians. And that group became the first of what we would call the Anabaptists. And the Anabaptists are the classic reformational movement of the radical wing. Now, this course isn't going to be on them. It's not going to be on the radicals per se, but they are an important part of the Reformation. In some ways, they are critical both of the Catholic Church and the magisterial reformers. The third category that we use has 2 names, one that is now out of date and not used at all by historians, and the other that is new, and that is the Counter or the Catholic Reformation. Now, in previous generations, all of the reform movements from within Catholicism was referred to by the title the Counter-Reformation. And this refers to the post-Reformation efforts by those within the Catholic Church who agreed with some of the principles of the critique by Protestants of the Catholic Church. And this was the effort by some within the Catholic Church to fix those problems. Now, the name Counter-Reformation has fallen out of vogue for a lot of reasons, but the more important reason that it's no longer used is because it sounds as if the Catholic Church only cared about reform as a counter or as an aggressive stance against Protestantism. Now, at times, some of the Catholic stances after the Reformation are significantly anti-Protestant. They're taken almost with barbs to try to stick it to the Protestants in some ways. But to refer to all of the reforms within Catholicism after the Reformation as simply a counter to the Reformation essentially makes us prejudiced against the motivation of those within Catholicism to effect change. And so increasingly, historians have referred to the Catholic Reformation to simply referring to the Catholic Church's efforts for reform. And within the broader sub-branch of the Catholic Reformation, there are evidences of both the traditional view of the Counter-Reformation, where they're going against Protestantism, but also of real internal change that is done without much care or concern about the Protestant church at all. It's cleaning their own house, putting their own house in order. So when we look at these three branches, these are the majority sort of brackets for understanding the movement theologically of the Reformation. So in this course, as we're looking at Luther and Calvin, what we're looking at is two of the major figures within the magisterial Reformation. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Coming up next, we're going to dive into Luther. We're going to start with his young life, look at where he came from, his backdrop, and we're going to start looking at the man who, in many ways, caused the entire Reformation himself.